So today we're going to talk about some basics of grammar and style. And so for your assignments this week, I ask you to kind of keep these in mind and maybe do a second reading of everything you submit to make sure that you're following these general guidelines. You'll also need to start thinking about your final paper topics, so keep that in mind as well. Throughout the week, you might do things like looking through notes and books from previous classes to think about what topics you might be interested in. So the reading for this week was from the AP manual, and it focuses on bias-free language. So if you haven't already, make sure that you read that because it goes into much more detail. But some general characteristics to be thinking about. First, you want to focus on relevant characteristics. So if there are characteristics that aren't relevant to whatever project or whatever point you're talking about, then you don't necessarily need to include detail. But you want to be appropriately specific. So when we talk about things like age, right, don't just say under 18. If you're talking about teenagers, you'd want to be specific in mentioning ages 15 to 18 or whatever that age range is, because under 18 can mean a lot of things. You want to name the condition or orientation rather than category. And you want, so that would be something like lesbian women as opposed to saying homosexuals. And you want to focus on specific income designation, right? So we want to avoid using terms like poor or rich in favor of being more specific, like people who are living below the federal poverty line. We also want to be really sensitive to labels. So a couple of ways we can do that. One is we want to use the language that people use to describe themselves within reason, but in general we try to take on the terms that people who have those identities are using. We want to avoid using adjectives as nouns. So we don't want to say things like the poor, the gays, schizophrenics. Instead, we use those aspects of people's individuals as adjectives to describe them. So individuals with schizophrenia or gay men, people are much more than the specific conditions or aspects of their lives that we're talking about, and so we don't want to label them just based on their condition, which really speaks to the next point as well. So we say people with autism instead of autistics or schizophrenics. We want to provide really clear definitions of what we're talking about, especially if we're talking about diagnostic criteria versus symptoms, things like that. And we also want to avoid kind of false hierarchies in terms of describing one group as better or worse than others. We also, so some groups that you may be talking about in your various writings, one is gender, and this is a big one that I'll bring up if you, well, I may raise any of these issues, but especially if your paper is about gender. The AP rule is that we can use male and female as adjectives, but they need to be followed by a noun. So we won't talk about males and females. Instead, we'll talk about either men and women or boys and girls. So we use those terms if we're using them as nouns. If we need to use it as an adjective, we might say something like male participants. So if you're using the term male or female, you want to follow it by a noun. We'd want to avoid kind of his, her. So if we're talking about someone whose gender could be either one, or we're talking about an individual, but it could be either, a man or a woman, it's okay to use they and them for singular. So when a participant does X, Y, and Z, they then do the next task. So that's a relatively new change in APA, but it helps deal with the gendered pronouns there. Okay. When we're talking about race and ethnicity, race tends to refer to physical differences in groups that are considered to have social significance, where ethnicity refers to cultural characteristics, so languages, practices, and beliefs, things like that. The race and ethnic terms that you use depend on the population and what you're studying. And some of these you need to be careful about which ones you use. So for example, Hispanic refers to people who speak Spanish, but not all people in Latin America speak Spanish. Let's see. Generally we capitalize black and white when we're referring to race. You want to use parallel terms. So if, for example, we're using black to refer to African Americans, we want to use white to refer to European Americans, or we could say African American and European American. It's either term is considered okay, but you just want to make sure that you're using parallel terms if you're comparing or referring to different groups. Minority generally kind of has a less than insinuation, so instead we want to use the term people of color or underrepresented groups, things like that. So those are just some general guidelines. The manual goes in a lot more detail, so I encourage you to read that and keep this in mind, especially when you get to the point where you're writing your paper. You maybe kind of need to deal with and think about how you use some of these terms. Okay, so I've got a couple of examples here. So if you haven't already, pause and go read that APA chapter before trying this. But what I'd like you to do is rephrase each of these sentences to reduce bias. So you can pause the video, go through each sentence and try to reduce the bias, and then when you're finished, you can go to the next slide or play the video and see the correct answers. Okay, so this is the key. So you can again pause this and compare to what you've got. For the first one, participants were asked to think of their favorite teacher from elementary school and rate him or her, or you could say rate them. But again, the way it was previously stated, it kind of made the assumption that the teacher was female, which is not accurate. Same for number 2, the experimenter can decide when he should provide the debriefing. The experimenter may also be female, and so we may we'll make it more gender neutral, or when they provide the debriefing. The term chairman is obviously a gender term, so we can just say department chair. The participants were 20 male students and 20 co-eds. So you can see here when we look at the use of male and female, it's used as an adjective as opposed to a noun. So we've got male students, and we want to have that parallel structure for female students. We've got some group stuff in the last question. So let me know if you have questions on these, but this is some good practice for you. Another example, so again, pause this, go through and look at the entire paragraph and see where you can rephrase sentences or the paragraph to reduce bias. Okay, so again, we have the term co-eds, which is kind of an antiquated term, but it's referring to female students. This refer to female college students as girls. And obviously we want to use girls and boys are okay to use when we're talking about children, but when we're talking about adults, we want to use men and women. Here we've got down below, they've kind of changed the terminology here. So they're saying these students acted more masculine. Well, what they mean is more assertive, and so they've made that a little more specific. So go ahead and review this carefully, compare it to your response, see kind of where you might work more on that biased language. All right, so one of the things we need to be aware of when we're writing is that we're setting an academic tone. So a couple of guidelines here. One is we avoid contractions. So things like don't, can't, wouldn't, we'd want to write that out. Do not, cannot, would not. Just kind of a general rule in academic writing. We also talked a little bit last week about one of the kind of first rules is to not write the way you talk. This is called a colloquial expression. Basically, it means a casual expression. So things like you know, got to, are things we say regularly, but we would not want to include these in our academic writing. We also want to avoid being vague. So vague expressions like a lot, some, practically all. Things like that. We want to try to be as specific as we can in the statements we're making. We also want to avoid hyperbolic language. So a hyperbole is an exaggerated statement that is not meant to be taken literally. So I can smell the pizza from a mile away, things like that, right? And so we want to be very careful in the way we write and be sure that the things we're saying are accurate. The biggest place I see this with students is things like saying things like all individuals with bipolar disorder struggle to maintain a steady job. Right? That's not true, and there are always exceptions when we're dealing with psychology. So you want to make sure that any way you phrase something when you're describing a pattern, you're describing it as a general pattern, but we know when we're talking about people, there are all exceptions, always exceptions. So we need to be very careful with that hyperbolic language. Make sure we're not exaggerating the finding or the point that we're trying to make. Okay, so this is really just for a resource for you. I encourage you to kind of come back to this as you're reviewing your writing and thinking about your writing. But this is just a list of transitions, and transitions are really important in effective writing because they make it easier for your reader to read and figure out what you're trying to say and kind of how it links to your previous points. So I encourage you to come back to this slide or save it so that you can, when you think about, okay, well, I want to show contrast. Well, what phrases can I use? Oh, look, here we've got although, conversely, despite, or I want to give an example. How can I introduce that in my paragraph? And so these are really great examples for those transition words. Okay, so a little practice. And again, I encourage you to pause the video and read this paragraph and insert transitions as you think they are necessary. Okay, so, and this is an example. These aren't necessarily the only right answer, but this is one way in which we could add transitions into this paragraph. Another one for you to practice on adding transitions to make it easier to read. And here are the responses. You can see in this example in particular, we've got some nice transitions that have different purposes. So for example, in particular, and then at the bottom we can see they've added in some to demonstrate that it's a concluding point. So next we're going to talk about what makes for a good paragraph. So a paragraph should be about 4 to 5 sentences. So a paragraph should definitely not be longer than 1 page. So make sure that you are taking a look at your writing. And if you have 1 page of full text and don't have any paragraphs breaks in there, you need to be thinking about where and how can I break this up. A paragraph is essentially a mini essay. And so it needs a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning and end of a paragraph are just 1 sentence each. And I'll talk about what goes into each of those. But you need to make sure as you're doing your writing this week that your paragraphs are about 4 to 5 sentences and you have a topic sentence and an end sentence in each one of those paragraphs. So that topic sentence should generally start with a hook to the previous paragraph. You can tie it in with a thought, repeat a word, or have some kind of transition. But it gives you some kind of segue, right? So if you're talking about different symptoms of depression and your first paragraph is about, feeling appetite changes, then you might start a new paragraph and say something like, in addition to appetite changes, another symptom of depression is sleep changes, right? And then that whole paragraph is going to be about sleep changes. You do want to make sure that your topic sentence is broad enough to cover the whole paragraph. So it should cover everything you're talking about in that paragraph. So if my paragraph was about sleep changes and intervention for sleep, then the example I gave you would not be broad enough. So you need to make sure that that topic sentence covers everything that you're going to talk about in the paragraph. Once you have that topic sentence, you're going to fill it in, use examples to make it coherent in the text. And then finally, you're going to end your sentence with end your paragraph with a final sentence, a concluding sentence. So this might restate your argument. Often the purpose of that last sentence in a paragraph is to tie that paragraph back to your thesis statement. So here's why this paragraph is relevant to the overall picture of my paper. So this is a really important function when we get to writing your final paper and making sure that your evidence supports your thesis. That last sentence in a paragraph can really bring your point home. Okay, so we're not going to talk a ton about grammar, but I do want to review a few basic things. And kind of at the simplest level, a good sentence, a good simple sentence should have a subject, who's the actor, a verb, which is the action, and an object, which is what is being acted on. So in a simple sentence and an active sentence, they generally go in this order: subject, verb, object. So this is when we use the active voice. So we've got the subject, verb, object. The explorer reached the summit. You may have heard people tell you not to use passive voice. So passive voice happens when you rearrange this order and put the object first. And so in this example, we've got the summit was reached by the explorer. So you can see we've got a lot more words here and it's a lot less clear, although they technically say the same thing. When we go with the active voice, it is much clearer. So this active voice is something that we really need to aim for. I've got a couple more examples on Canvas for you to look at with regard to the difference between active and passive voice. I think one great way to do this is to do the by zombies test. And so if we look at, if you can add the phrase by zombies to the end of a sentence and it still makes sense, then it's using passive voice. So she was killed by zombies is passive voice, okay? Zombies killed her. We can't, it doesn't make sense to say zombies by zombies killed her. The zombies are the ones doing the action, so we want to have them listed first as the subject, and then we've got the verb of killed and the object is her. So putting the by zombies at the end of your sentence, if you're not sure if it's passive voice, is one trick that may work for you in figuring out, are you using passive voice, which in general in APA style should be avoided. Okay, a little bit about compound sentences. So, and complex sentences. So compound sentences link two equally weighted simple sentences. So we've got two parts, two complete sentences that are put together into a whole sentence. They're normally linked with and, but, or, yet, still, or a colon or a semicolon. So I've got some examples here. The woman had on appropriate shoes for the snowstorm and she looked warm and prepared. Okay, those are separate sentences. The woman had on appropriate shoes for the snowstorm. She looked warm and prepared. Each are standalone sentences, but we've put them together with an and. We've got the semicolon one, the freshmen were using community bathrooms, standalone sentence. It was an unusual experience for some of them, standalone sentence. This is really the only time you should be using a semicolon, and generally I urge students to just make it a separate sentence. But the rule for a semicolon is it should be two standalone sentences that you're putting together for some reason if you're going to use a semicolon. A complex sentence has a primary sentence and a lesser sentence. So here the hook are things like although, because, where, when, after, if. So the woman had on appropriate shoes for the snowstorm, standalone sentence. She still looked cold is also a standalone sentence, but we've got them combined with the word although. So the woman had on appropriate shoes for the snowstorm, although she looked cold. So we've got a couple other examples of these complex sentences. And again, here one is the primary sentence, and then the other is the lesser sentence, but they're combined into one. Okay, another good thing or another thing to be thinking about as we're writing good sentence is parallel construction. So this is really referring to when we're comparing or listing or contrasting things, we want to use similar forms. And so this is particularly true when we have these, when we're either listing equivalent ideas or have parallel coordinators. So parallel coordinators are things like both, and, either or, not only, but also, right? So these kind of, so we want to make sure that whatever objects we're talking about have the same construction. So I've got a couple examples. So here's one: knowing Greek and Roman antiquity is not just learning to speak their language, but also their culture. Okay, so we should be able to insert language and culture. Either way, we should be able to switch them around if they have parallel construction. But can we learn to speak a culture? No, that doesn't make sense. And so we might want to think about rephrasing this in something like, knowing Greek and Roman antiquity is not just learning to speak their language, but also understand their culture, right? So we've got that verb in both places so that we could switch them around, and we could say is not just learning to understand their culture, but also speak their language. So again, if it's parallel, we could switch the two things around and it would still make sense. Okay, so a couple of examples to think about faulty parallelisms. So again, the goal here is to make the two things that are listed. We've got not only but also's as the big transition here, and try to make it so that these terms are parallel. Okay, and once you've done those, you can proceed, and we've got the examples here, making sure, or the key here, making sure that these are parallel. And again, there's not just one right way to do this. This is just an idea for you to figure out kind of the best phrasing, the best way to get this them parallel. That it's not the only way. Okay, another big thing that I find is an issue for many students is wordy sentences. Longer sentences are not better. In fact, shorter sentences are often better. So I really encourage you, when you do your writing this week, to write down write your paper, and then go back and try to make it shorter. Find wordy sentences and try to eliminate words. So normally shorter sentences are better and clearer, often, not always, but often. So things that you can do: count your words, count how many words you have at the start before you start editing, figure out which words carry meaning, or rearrange the words to make the meaning more clear and eliminate words. Okay, so here's an example for you to try for yourself. It was voted that there would be a driver for the cleaning up of the People's Park. So count how many words are in there, and then see if you can rearrange it or cut words to make this clearer and shorter. Okay, so we start with 17 words, and it's passive voice, right? So it was voted by zombies that there would be a drive for the cleanup, right? So it's passive voice. The people doing the voting is not the first thing, it's not the subject of the sentence. So if we rephrase it to, we voted to clean up the People's Park, we've gotten it down to 8 words from 17, and it's much clearer what the point is. Some other things to avoid when we're trying to correct wordy sentences: stretchers. So things that just make a sentence longer. To be, there is, it is when. Normally we can make these things shorter, so be on the lookout for those. Of and which, or the use of, are terms that we can often cut. So for example, when we use is when, we often use is when in definitions. So schizophrenia is when an individual has delusions and hallucinations. That's 9 words. If instead we say schizophrenia involves delusions and hallucinations, we've cut it down to 5 words and it's much clearer. If we're looking at of which, generally we can eliminate the ofs and whiches. So for something like he persuades us through the use of logic, we can just say he persuades through logic, right? And get straight to the point, eliminate a few of those unnecessary words. Another way we can cut down words is when we have too many nouns. So when we're using multiple nouns to describe things. So things like advance notice, color lipstick, reader interest. Normally we can cut these down to just 1 word and make it a little clearer, a little more concise. Okay, so little more practice. And here I've put the initial number of words in each phrase. And take a second, pause the video, see if you can identify what's wrong, and make it shorter. Okay, so again, here are the responses. So take a look at how they compare, how many words you got. And again, this is not the only way to rephrase these sentences and cut down on words. There are many different ways, but the goal is to make it as clear as possible. So again, as you're working on your writing this week, practice these things, avoiding bias, concise wording, parallel construction. Write your assignments the first time and then go back and specifically look for the points in this lecture to make sure that you are getting your writing as clear as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time, but the way that you're going to learn these skills is by practicing, by editing your writing to address some of these specific points.